Hello, it's Jason again. I'm back. It's been a while for various reasons, and it's time for me to have talk number 5. I believe it's number 5. Anyway, it's next. And this one will be a little bit difficult. It's not my favorite talk. It doesn't move the plot, so to speak, for one. And two, there's no way I'm going to keep it under 15 minutes. I thought about breaking it up into 2 smaller segments, but I think it's just better for me to power through this talk. So I want to recap a little bit though. What's the purpose of all this? These talks are about the de-spiritualization of our modern society. And I've discussed what I meant by that, what a spirit is, how science comes into play, and science fiction, and intuition, and free will, and all that. If you forgot about that, you can review the first 3 or 4. But of course, one of the questions that will come up is why? Why are we seeing de-spiritualization? What's the cause of it? And so I'm going to talk about that. Now, last time I talked quite a bit about science, maybe the last 2 times, about how it has its limitations in this discussion, because since I have defined spirit as that part of us which is not physical, science cannot observe. There's no way for us to observe a spirit or to study a spirit, and therefore it falls outside the realm of science. So science can't really help with that. We also looked at how in science fiction, when science does try to solve all of our problems, when we look to the future and imagine the future, we see that science often either doesn't solve the problem, because no matter how advanced our tools are, no matter how much better more comfortable we've made life, or how advanced our machines and technology and so forth, there's still something in here that causes it to fall apart, because people are still sectarian. There's still us versus them. There's still greed. There's still power struggles. There's still these things that lead to wars and conflict and so forth. And with now we just have bigger and bigger weapons, so it makes things actually kind of scarier. If power corrupts and our power keeps getting greater, corruption will be more visible, right? You'll have more dire consequences. And we see this not just in science fiction, we've seen this in actual history. The stronger our weapons get, the more chance there is of mass destruction. That's what are called, weapons of mass destruction, correct? Anywho, the other limitation is, of course, if science does create a society where we do all get along, there aren't any wars, there isn't any conflict, it always seems to be at the expense of a soul, a spirit. It always looks like a soulless society where everyone's content, but they're content like sedated sheep or something. They seem to be in some sort of stupor, and they've lost what makes them human. So from that, we'll segue into, okay, the number 1 cause of de-spiritualization, I believe, and there are a few I might get into today, but the main one is the ascent of science. Now, I think in a common sense sort of way, we can realize that the more science has excelled, the more our scientific knowledge of the world around us has advanced, the less spiritual we become. And part of that, of course, is because the ancients would have used gods and goddesses and spirits of various kind to explain physical phenomena. Okay, so because they didn't have the scientific means to explain physical phenomena, they inserted gods and spirits and mighty beings into the roles of those who, kind of control the world around us. Well, science has continued to chip away at all that, and we now see that the world is governed by rules, the rules of nature, the laws of nature, and the laws of physics, and they're testable and observable and so forth. And so we've seen that take place. There's a quote that's really popular out there, and let's see if I can pull it up here. I can't. Anyway, but it's from Neil deGrasse Tyson about how, and sometimes I've seen it taken out of context sometimes, where they don't do the whole sentence or the sentence around it. They just say this. God is an ever, I think, decreasing pocket of ignorance. Like it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. But in the context, he's saying if this is how you see God, if you see God as the one who's in charge of the things that science has not yet explained, he calls it God of the gaps. Although I don't think that's his term. I think that's been around. The idea that because there's gaps in our scientific knowledge, well, that must be God. More specifically, the subject was dark matter, and it's the idea that scientists have come up with the theory of dark matter to explain why there's more gravitational pull, it seems, than is explainable by the observable matter. Of course, they know the formula for gravitational pull and the power that you would see, and they've seen that there's a greater gravitational pull in parts of the galaxies than what the observable mass would indicate. And so they postulate, well, maybe there's a mass that we can't see that's also exerting gravitational pull that would explain it. And I guess some people have jumped on that and said, maybe that's this God doing his thing. And so the full quote is that if that's how you're going to prove God, if that's going to be your evidence for God, is that he's the one behind the physical phenomena that science hasn't explained yet, then God is an ever decreasing pocket of ignorance. And it's a very valid point. But it brings up an assumption, though, that maybe he's talking about this because he's dealt with people that do have this assumption, and that is the idea that the idea of God's started a long time ago in order to explain physical phenomena. But of course, that's not necessarily true, as we've already seen from the talk, maybe my second talk or so, about intuition. There are many things that have nothing to do with science because we don't observe them directly, like rain and seasons and things falling to earth. But there are things we observe indirectly that we intuit are true, such as free will and the actual existence of right and wrong, and that there should be a reason to choose right over wrong. It shouldn't just be because it's good, but because there's actually a long-term reason to choose good over evil, and so forth. So, because we can see that the ancients also did care about those things. They had rules, they had laws, they had ideas of justice and punishment and reward and so forth. So, if we relegate God to just physical nature, that's it, then yes, science will erode the idea of God because science explains physical phenomena more and more and more and more as we study it. Now, this is the problem. I mentioned before, I don't think there's any way to scientifically prove God exists because I think it's a fool's errand, because you're asking someone to prove by physical things that a non-physical being exists. And that's why I went to the intuition part of it. And we got into free will and all that stuff. Anyway, so this is one of the reasons that the belief in God is in the spirit in general. I've been throwing in the word God a lot there. That's because I think we intuit again that if there is such a thing as a spirit, where did it come from? I mean, we can say if our bodies came from whatever, from physical stuff that evolved and whatever. You can say that about the physical thing, but if we had a spirit, that can't evolve. There's no gene that creates a spirit because a gene is a physical thing and whatever and so on. So if you have a spirit, it seems that spirits must have already existed, and if there's a right and wrong and there's a purpose and that kind of thing, we do intuit, well, there must be a higher spirit. So that does see these things and does know what's going on in your heart. However, since science has had such a successful track record of knowledge, not necessarily being used well, as I mentioned before, it can be used to do terrible things as well, But in terms of accumulated knowledge, science has a very, very strong track record, especially in the last 200 years, right? People, I think, wanted to jump onto the science train and even use science to prove God. And that may have been a mistake. I'm not sure. I'm actually undecided about that. It's difficult because, again, you're trying to use physical data to prove a non-physical entity. But since it's happened, what it does is it shows that there's been a shift to, science is the way to prove something. Science is the way to know something. If you can't prove it scientifically, if you can't know it scientifically, then I think at first it went to, then you don't know if it's true or not. To now it's going so far, it's like, then it must not be true. If you can't prove it scientifically, if you can't know it scientifically, then it's just not true. It's just made up. And I think that's part of what's happened. So the ascent of science has eroded the idea of the spirit. Now, again, I'd like to say that the reason this has happened is because the ancients, maybe they created God, the idea of gods, for several reasons. One of those, though, would have been the non-physical reasons we talked about, the idea of right and wrong, and free will, and so on, and justice, eternal justice of some kind, or end justice, we'll say. But of course, some of it was to explain physical things. Now, the part that was used to explain physical phenomenon has been pretty much done away with by science. Now, but if you've noticed a theme here, the theme is this: the science, nature and science on one hand, and the spirit on the other hand, are two different planes. And this is why, as we said, if we treat humans like they're just physical bodies, and the mind is just a product of the brain, and the brain only, it brings into question the fact that it questions the idea that we would have free will. It's hard to see how we could. And we also see through our attempts to solve things through science alone that there's something in here that's not solved. The same old jealousies and infighting and greed and power struggle and all that stuff just keeps continuing, which is something we intuit. And we also talked about how basic human rights is something we intuit. There's really no scientific reason to value human life so highly, and especially the life of the individual. There's really no reason to do that at all. If we want what's best for the species, we would definitely not exalt the individual as highly as we do. But if there's an eternal spirit involved, then suddenly the individual even alone has great value. So my point in all this is, if we are both physical and spiritual, then this world contains both. And the science handles the physical very, very well, maybe perfectly, maybe eventually, I don't know. Whereas the spiritual was not handled by the science. Now, ancient man, who would have been very limited in their scientific knowledge, would have put much more emphasis on the spiritual to explain things. Their problem was they were using spiritual things to explain physical phenomena. So they overextended spirituality. And it wasn't just it wasn't just a matter of their intuition, of knowing that humans are unique and the individual is important and free will is real and so is morality, all these things. It wasn't just that. They also extended it to cover all sorts of things they couldn't explain in the physical world. As we moved, and the physical world became more and more and more understood and explained through science, the importance of the spirit world shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. Now, part of that is good, because it's better for us to think that diseases are caused by germs than by a spiritual force. Because by believing that it's caused by germs, we can study those germs, we can develop cures, right? Whether it's, I don't need to tell you what the cures are. We know, cures or preventions, vaccines, all sorts of things we can do, because we now realize that spiritual forces weren't behind those maladies. So to some degree, it's a good thing. Like I said, I'm not against science. Science should be explaining the physical world, and it's been doing that very, very well. The problem is it's explained it so well and erase so much of what had made them into spirits that people have gone to the extreme of saying, well, then maybe there's just no spiritual stuff at all. Maybe there isn't any spirit. Maybe it's just all made up stuff. It's just made up to explain the physical world because they were ignorant of science. And so now, if you keep going in that direction, you'll see that what will happen now is that everything is explained through science. But in order to explain everything through science, again, you have to have the assumption that everything is physical. There's nothing that's not physical. And so you have to assume there is no spirit. Now, don't get me wrong, and a scientist should proceed in their studies disregarding the spirit because it doesn't fit into his scientific studies. There's no way to include a spirit into your scientific study. You just can't. But that doesn't mean, and I think that's part of the problem, is people think that because scientists would say, oh, that's unscientific, people have come to think, well, that means it can't be true. But of course, something can be true if it's not scientific, if it doesn't fall within the realm of science because it's not physical. Anyway, this ascent of science, because it explained so many physical phenomena that used to be explained by the actions of gods and goddesses and spirits and so forth, has diminished the role of spirituality. And like I said, to some degree that's good because we shouldn't spiritualize everything. So much of the world is physical. The parts that we observe and study through science are physical. So it makes sense for that to happen. But it's kind of like what the old phrase of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But if we just say, oh, so in that case, if something isn't scientific, it isn't real. That's not really true. A better way to say it, if it's not scientific, it's not physical. It's not part of the physical realm. And it's not part of in adherence to physical laws. That's legitimate, of course. But as I said before, we do seem to have this intuition of things that we like, and we enjoy it. We enjoy the idea that an individual human being is of great value. But on a purely physical level, there's really no reason to believe that. And that's one of the problems we see with the ascent of science is it came after spiritual beliefs. And as a result, spiritual beliefs exalted mankind in a certain way because we saw ourselves as different from the other animals, created uniquely. In different religions, you can see this, that man was created uniquely from the other animals, and his faculties other animals don't because we're related to the gods somehow, right? So science comes along and gets rid of all that. Because we're living in a post-spiritual world, or if in my culture you might say post-Christian or post-theistic world, the benefits of the theistic world are still there. The idea that man is seen as a high being is still there. But if you really kick God out from underneath the whole thing and go back and re-examine everything, there's absolutely no reason to exalt man. There really isn't, especially the individual. If you want to say we should take care of our species, fine, we should take care of our species, but there's really no reason to have such a high view of an individual, because our species would do better if we had a better resource to individual level or ratio than we do. So, but the thing is, we do hold these truths to be self-evident, that we were created with certain rights that we were given by the Creator. So we still prefer to believe that, even though we're trying to say there's no evidence for a God. Well, there's no scientific evidence because physically we are animals. On the physical level, we have bodies. That's why experimenting on lab rats and so forth is actually very useful, because their DNA and our DNA, not as different as you think. And so we can run these tests and we can discover things about our bodies without actually damaging us. But the reason we do these on mice instead of on people is because you can't treat people that way, because people are special. And it would be abhorrent to us to think of us performing experiments on other human beings, because each human individual has a certain sacredness to them. And there's no scientific or natural physical reason to believe that. So because science has come along afterward. Um, a good example of this is some animal rights people have lifted up animals to having the same value as humans. Now, if there's no spirit, that makes a lot of sense. However, why would we lift animals up? Why wouldn't we put ourselves down and say, hey, where's the animals too? There's nothing special about any of us. But because we exalted man first, and then we kicked out the support system of that, the idea that we were created in God's image or something, we still enjoy this lofty view of ourselves. And now it's like, oh, let's lift the animals up to us. When in fact, the whole reason we were up here in the first place was because we did believe that we had a spirit. We did believe we were related to the gods somehow, in a way the animals weren't. But if none of that's true, and there is no spirit, we should actually not have a higher view of animals. We should have a lower view of ourselves. And some people do that. Some people are content with that. Some people would say, yes, we're insignificant species on a little blue marble among billions of blue marbles that are out there and so forth. And some people, they're content to take up that view. But most people really aren't. We intuit that there's still something special about us. And we act that way. Our rules reflect it, the way we treat each other and the way we compare ourselves to other animals, it reflects that. So, anyway, so one of the reasons we're becoming less and less spiritual is because science has done such a great job of explaining the physical world that we wonder if there is a spiritual world. Because the mistake the ancients made was they explained so much of the world in spiritual terms, and science came along and re-explained it a lot better, right? That's a fact. That's true. Even though I'm a proponent of the spirit and spirituality, I'm not going to sit here and say that science didn't explain the physical world a lot better. It did. It does. It's supposed to. That's its focus. But it can't explain the spiritual. And it can't disprove the spiritual or support the spiritual. This is where, again, intuition comes in. And we see that we still intuit these things because we act like it. Right? But there's such a fear of sounding foolish, of sounding unscientific, that I think the spiritual has been kind of downplayed or ignored because it can sound like a superstition. But the difference is superstitions would have used a spiritual entity to explain a physical thing for which there is no a scientific explanation. And this is why Neil deGrasse Tyson's quote is actually pretty good. If your belief in God is based on the fact that our scientific knowledge is limited in the realm of the physical world, then you've got a problem. But of course, I would counter, if you believe, and I think he would too, and I don't think he's anti-God, or anti-religion even if he's not, if your belief in God isn't based on the scientific evidence or lack of scientific evidence, but it's something different, right? If it's relational, if you believe he's a spirit and you have a spirit and you connect with him, that's different. Then it doesn't matter what science does. Because science has explained my body, but it won't explain my spirit. Okay, so that's the number one reason, of course, is science has done such a great job of explaining away so many things that have been assigned to spiritual forces that people have begun to doubt whether those spiritual forces even exist. But there are other things. So, if we have a spirit, I would say what we intuit is that it's part of our mind. Our mind would be composed of the mental, the brain, the physical aspect, which is our brain, and the spiritual aspect, which allows for free will. It allows us to do things that don't conform to the laws of physics in our head. Like we mentioned that before, how Professor Green at Columbia University explains convincingly to me that we don't have free will. That's because he's a scientist who believes in physics and the physical world only. And as a result of that, he would believe that our mind is simply the function of the brain, and the brain everything in the brain is simply following the laws of physics. Whether they're chemical laws or subatomic laws or whatever laws they are, there's no way to choose anything. You can't choose to follow the laws of physics. Everything just does follow the laws of physics. And the way your brain follows those laws of physics results in your ideas, thoughts, and feelings that you imagine perhaps are free and yours, but they're not. However, if the mind is a combination of the activity of the brain and a spirit that is not subject to the laws of physics because it is not physical, then all that free will and the dignity of man, all that stuff comes back. Okay, but all of our science and technology, besides science explaining things so well, we're now so connected through technology. And as a result, it becomes less and less spiritual. It's hard to detect someone's spirit or spiritualness or spirituality online. In fact, it's so hard to detect anything online that it's easy to pretend to be someone else. You know, we all know about catfishing and Nigerian princes and all this kind of stuff, and people pretending to be somebody they're not, or even dating apps, right? It's kind of the point where you don't even know. Not only do you not know if the person you're talking to online is anything like that person, you're not even sure if it's a person. And so you even have tests to try to prove you're not a robot. So, and as AI increases, that's going to become even more and more a problem. But since our technology is so much more and more involved in our communication, we're only seeing people's typed responses, maybe their photos and that kind of thing, and we're not connecting with them in a very spiritual way. We're connecting with them in less, not even physical ways. That's the other thing. If you believe that the spirit is connected to us in some way, up in here and there and here, or whatever, over the distance, it's tougher to observe that. You're just going to connect with people's faces and which might not even be their face, right? Welcome to the internet, right? And their opinions and all that kind of stuff. And that's why it's easier for people to be mean and cruel and not show dignity and respect, human dignity to other people online, is because they don't seem as human. All they are is a collection of ideas in a profile photo. And so it's easier to say and act in a very dehumanizing sort of way, because you're not encountering a spiritual being, you're encountering a collection of thoughts in a photo. And I think that's another thing that's really contributing to de-spiritualization. One more thing I'd like to mention here in passing is pornography. Pornography has been around for a long time, but never has it been so easy to access, and at such young ages, because the places that pervade this, they don't care if you're 18 or not. You got to click on a button probably, but they don't make you approve it somehow. And pornography is essentially a very de-spiritualizing enterprise. The idea is that we are physical, and so the physical aspects, the physical attributes are usually very exaggerated. If there's a story, the plot is terrible, the acting is bad. These are all jokes people make about pornography, right? And there's a reason for that. If the acting was really good, if the story was really good, it would lose its pornographicness, right? If this woman, you find out that the reason she's sleeping around is because she's so numb. She's so numb. She just wants to feel something because she's been watching her mother, die slowly through cancer in the hospital, and she's just so numb she wants to feel something. That would really kill the pornographic angle, because now you'd start to care about her, and you can't, right? The whole point of pornography, in a sense, is not to care about the people. It's just to treat them like purely physical beings that are doing, and that's the thing, it treats an act of sex that can be a very spiritual experience, a very tender and special experience. And it treats it like it's just a merely physical thing, and so so the people acting it are also treated like very merely physical things. They're just physical things, using their physical parts, and I think this has really had a negative impact. I mean, it always has, but these days it's just so prominent. or so easy to get to, I guess is a better way to say it, that I think it's causing real problems. So I'll stop here, but I'll just to sum up the things that are making some of the things that are making us less and less spiritual. One, I think number one is science. Science has explained away so much that used to be assigned to spirits. It shouldn't have been, but it was because they didn't have the scientific knowledge. So they tried to use spiritual means to explain physical phenomena, and science has done away with that. And as a result, the spiritual world shrunk. But it could have shrunk to its correct size, where it still explained all the non-physical things. But now it's questioned whether those non-physical things even exist. We don't act like it. We do still treat people like we're different. We do still use words like man-made and natural. We do still feel like we're a unique being in this planet and that each individual is important. We still feel like people should have certain human rights, even though there's really, if they're just physical beings, why? And so on. But anyway, science has excelled so much at explaining away the physical that we've become focused on the physical. It's like, hey, science can solve physical problems. Let's just focus on the physical. And if we just focus on the physical, then we ignore the spiritual. And don't get me wrong, if someone is a scientist, at their job at least, that is their job, is to focus on the physical. They can't bring spiritual explanations into their physical research. But of course, in their private life, they could still believe in God. And in fact, that's the way most scientists used to be. Some argue it's because they were still ignorant, but I don't believe that. I believe they just saw the value. I believe people like Newton and Mendel and those people that were clearly Christian still believed in a spiritual being, still believed in God and in the spirit, because science doesn't explain a lot of things that aren't physical, like morality and purpose and free will and things like that. And let's not forget that a lot of the people who are on the frontiers of science were actually under the belief that God did create the world, and that by understanding the rules of nature, they would get a glimpse of God. So, but anyway, so the ascent of and prominence of science, the success of science to explain physical phenomenon has unfortunately had the side effect of us looking to science and physical explanations for everything, even things that aren't physical. Or we just shrug and say, well, then we don't even know if it's real or not. So why bother? We've become kind of agnostic, not just about God existing, but agnostic about our own spirit existing. And so, like, why focus on this thing that we might or might not have, that we can't really prove it scientifically, when we can focus all of our energy on this thing on the body that we know we have, and on the method that we know works. And that's understandable. But I think it's a mistake. And the other things I mentioned was our advanced technology and our way of dealing with people has become less personal. And of course, I mentioned pornography, which is a good example, I think, of de-spiritualizing people, that it literally turns them into just physical bodies, doing an act that has now become purely physical. And so we don't care about their storyline. We don't care whether the actors are good actors or not, because it's got nothing to do with the purpose of pornography, which is to see a human being as simply a physical thing, doing a physical thing, and that's it. Okay, so this one did go longer, as I mentioned, and it doesn't really move the talk forward as to what is wrong with de-spiritualization, what are the possible negative outcomes of this, and what can we do about it. But it does give a little bit of explanation as to perhaps why we are less spiritual than we used to be.